Hey all, here are OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a throwback look at the Asus Eee PC, the 1001PA, which is a pretty classic model. It was released almost a decade ago, and that was when the netbook trend first started to take off. Here in 2019, the equivalent of netbooks, as we know it, is pretty much Chromebook or Chrome OS powered machines, which are light, fast, and can very quickly boot up and give us the essentials of web browsing. But netbooks back in the day still ran on a pretty heavy Windows operating system. They were a lot more sluggish, but their form factor was also more portable than a full-blown machine, even though, again, they're not as powerful as, say, a regular laptop either. Now, this particular machine sold for about $300 at the time, which was fairly inexpensive, and it was also nicknamed the Seashell just because of the texture that Asus put on the plastic material here. It kind of reminds me of carbon fiber and gives it a little bit more of a premium look, despite the fact that it was a budget model. Now, the netbook here actually had two variants, one which came with Windows XP Home Edition and one which came with Windows 7 Starter Edition, which is the one that we have today. Now, what's really interesting about this machine really isn't the specs, just because almost all netbooks from 2009 to 2010 were about the same. It ran on a single-core Intel Atom processor clocked at 1.44 gigahertz. All of the netbooks pretty much had a 10-inch display. All of them pretty much had only 1 gigabyte of RAM and roughly 200 gigabytes of built-in hard drive space. So that is one difference with today's Chromebooks, is we've migrated to solid-state drives or flash-based memory, which are more efficient and faster, but the technical storage space is also smaller because Google is giving you cloud storage compared to this, which actually had a larger, pretty traditional spinning hard drive. Now, the interesting thing about this particular machine is Asus put in a dual boot operating system that was called ExpressGate. It was almost found on all of their Eee PCs and allows you to boot up within seconds a light operating system based on Linux, which allows you to browse the web, access files and images and music from your device without getting into the full-blown Windows operating system, which would take a minute or two to completely load up. So it was a very interesting solution that you could access just by pressing on the power key and choosing which option you wanted to get into. And really this idea, the ExpressGate Quick Boot operating system, is actually what inspired Google to create Chrome OS. That single-core Intel Atom processor, by the way, has a CPU benchmark score of under 300. So if you think that the latest generation Atom chips are bad, they have a benchmark score of around 1,000 or so. Again, this is just a fraction of that, so keep that in mind. But it does allow the battery efficiency to be really strong, because this unit can last over 11 hours on a single charge, which is still a pretty impressive metric, even all these years later. So taking a closer look at the design, again, aside from the texture, there's not too much that's going on from this material. It still looks fairly modern, I have to say, and fits in with Asus's current design language as well. Otherwise, here's what it looks like from the side. We have a tapered edge, we have a full-size SD card reader, there's a split 3.5mm jack for audio in and out, there's also two USB 2.0 ports, a Ethernet port for wired internet, something that we simply don't see anymore these days on netbooks, and there's also a proprietary Asus power port and a VGA port. So in fact, this machine did not come with a HDMI port. That really does show its age. Here's the third USB port, and there's also a Kingston lock and some ventilation grills, because yes, back then Intel Atoms were still requiring a fan. So unlike today's fanless machines, it still consumed a little bit of power, which makes the 11-hour battery life even more impressive. Flipping things open, we're greeted to a pretty cramped keyboard by today's standards, even though Asus is trying its best to fill up the kind of borders and width of the machine, and the tiny touchpads or trackpads were easily one of the more infuriating aspects of netbooks back in the day. However, it did support multi-touch, so at least you could use it for pinch to zoom, just everything was on a very minuscule kind of proportion in size. Now on the top here is where we have two keys. Now the first key here is the regular power button, and the second key here is how you launch into the ExpressGate. And then the display itself actually is a matte display, so it doesn't reflect as much sunlight, definitely good, but it's a regular TN panel, which means that viewing angles are not going to be as good as IPS screens. So overall, a pretty clean and a typical looking design as far as these netbooks are concerned. If we take a quick look at a modern Asus Chromebook, We can see the difference there in terms of size is pretty dramatic. But certain elements of the design, including the chrome ring along the webcam, have actually been retained even on their new models almost a decade later. So I've tapped on the Express key over here, and right now it's launched into the interface already. So that took just under 2 seconds. Even faster, I think, than a Chromebook, because Chromebooks, you have to still enter the password. So that is incredibly fast for such a ancient hardware. The first function here is just web, and I can also take a look at some other features like accessing say a photo manager, so I can take a look at the images stored onto my hard drive. Again, kind of interesting that this is not password encrypted, but security concerns aside, still is pretty interesting to see. And we also have what looks like online gaming, so that's probably going to be some very basic games that are built on in. So if we want to do something like accessing the web, for instance, let's just see how that functions. It's basically running on a version of Firefox, I believe, that's been optimized to perform a little bit better. With a fast speed of only 8 seconds, the Asus Express Gate offers a unique environment that allows you to enjoy instant access to commonly used functions, such as a web browsing portal or communication without entering the traditional OS. So here it's loaded up the Asus USA page using the Splashtop browser, again based off of Firefox, and I can actually do some quick news searches, and it actually works all right in terms of speed, as you can see here. It is very much optimized. Again, all the system components are just going into the browser right now, which is part of the reason why performance is going to be faster than if you went into Windows and then also opened up, say, Internet Explorer or Chrome. So if I wanted to tap on this Wikipedia page, let's see how long it takes to load. Of course, the fact that the browser is out of date means that certain pages will no longer render in as beautiful or as correctly as on today's modern devices. So keep that in mind, and you do have to still be slightly more patient. But simple text-based pages like Wikipedia, as you can see here, are still being handled without too many problems, surprisingly. So here we've got some images that we can load up, and here it is. We're able to do a slideshow, for example. I can zoom and crop and be able to interact with these images that I have loaded along. So you can use it for the purposes of some light media viewing directly. It's restricted to being basically a digital photo frame at this time. And again, the TN panel doesn't have the best viewing angles, which means that if you kind of start tilting it, the colors are definitely not as good as on a more expensive computer. But still, even after all these years, it seems like there's still very budget computers out there using a TN screen. So for something from 10 years ago, actually not as bad as you would think. As far as the Windows side is concerned, there's really not too much to write home about, because performance, again, is identical. We've seen it many times already on other netbooks with these same internals, so we're not going to really cover that part in too much detail. Again, it's quite sluggish by today's standards, so if you want the best environment, I would recommend wiping it and installing, again, a Mint Linux or another lighter Linux distribution. So that's more or less it as far as our revisited look at the Asus Eee PC 1001PA, really a classic machine and one of the most popular netbooks released almost a decade ago. Surprisingly, the hardware actually still looks quite modern after all these years, even though it's made out of plastic. And again, the most interesting thing about this model would be that secondary Quick Boot OS. Overall, the concept was definitely ahead of its time, even though I'm glad that netbooks of 2009 are no longer here with us with those tiny cramped touchpads and ancient processors. You can learn more details in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That has been our Asus Eee PC Seashell netbook.